Hey, what's good everybody? My name is Alckemy. Welcome to the channel. This is part 2 of Season 3 Comprehensive Guide to NeuroBass. If you haven't seen the first part, I'd recommend that you go watch that, or what you can also do is go and watch Season 2 and Season 1. I don't know why I said that backwards, but today we're going to be focusing on filtering. There's a lot of stuff that I have to cover, so I'm going to try to move pretty quickly, but the key to getting good filtering out of NeuroBass is really understanding a couple of things. For one of the most important things that you will get is like what filter goes where, and of course like that's subjective, but you know, like specifically talking about like where would you place a band pass to get what kind of specific sound, or a notch filter, what makes something sound like it's talking versus what makes something sound like it's squelchy. How does it develop a relationship when you use an EQ or when you push distortion and have a relationship with filtering? And then also we can talk about things like multiband. So as you can tell, there's a lot of different things for me to look at, but before we get into that, I'm going to provide a quick demonstration to you to understand like how easy it is to actually start getting the tonalities of a NeuroBass. Right now, I've got something that's just as simple as a sine wave. And all I'm going to do is grab a distortion unit just like this. And then I'm going to grab a filter and we're going to duplicate this. And then we're going to duplicate this. So we've got distortion, filter, filter, and then maybe one more distortion. So one of the key principles that we can talk about is something that I think that Frequent gave to the world, which is called sine compression. He's pretty much the first person that I've ever heard say something like that, and I don't know particularly where he got it from or if he made it up, but it doesn't matter. What we have now is a couple of notches here with a large slope, and we're going to automate with a randomizer where these two kind of move off and on. So take a listen to this. Let's grab a randomizer like this. This one is going to go here. We'll set this to a fast rate, kind of like that, and then we will duplicate this. So what we're going to do is this one is going to go up. This one is going to go down by quite a bit. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the same modulators and do the opposite of what the one on top is doing. So they're going to kind of be pit against each other. So let's listen to how this sounds. So you can tell that by just having a couple of like key tools and knowing how to do something like that, you're already starting to get these characteristics. And then all of the effects that kind of, how do you say, come afterward, all the subsequent effects can really just be like shaping specific characteristics that you want to use. So one thing that I'll do over here is I'm going to add a limiter. But from this point on, like there's a lot of different things that we can use to manipulate or change the idea of what it is that we're trying to do. A lot of times we start with something like a respace, right? But depending on what tonality you're going for, if you know how to use filtering, then you can pretty much like pull that particular characteristic out of almost any sound, provided you've got harmonics. The theory behind how all this stuff works is that if you've got a really thick sound that is harmonically rich, regardless of if you're adding harmonics through FM or through distortion or a combination of both, or stacking sounds before you filter it, you're going to give the filter more to cut. That's the like fundamental principle. What comes after that is understanding what filter frequencies, or like what frequencies sound like whenever a filter is interacting with it, regardless of what kind of band it is. And by band, I mean like what different filter type. So as a quick example, if I play something that is kind of in the low mid region right here, then we can isolate these frequencies and kind of listen to how that sounds on its own. So take a listen here. Let me move this back by a significant amount. I'm also going to deactivate the resonance here. Okay, so if this were a robot, what would he be saying? Whoa, right? So we can kind of already tell that by pushing or by focusing on the low mid frequencies, that is giving us some kind of low vocal tonality. Likewise, the further that we go up along the frequency range, the more, I guess, kind of high pitch, or you can even say it in some cases, the more squelchy it's going to become. So let's go ahead and sweep up. I'm going to give this a higher harmonic, or sorry, a higher pitch, so that way we can tell what this is doing. Even if we want to maybe stack this with an octave, so that way we've got something else to cut through. And one thing that it brings up a good point naturally here is that in order for a filter to sound like it's working, it has to have frequencies to cut through. So let's give it some. So you can see that by sweeping these frequencies here in the higher region, you're naturally getting that kind of squelchy, nasally sound. And it doesn't really matter what frequency band you use. That's something that kind of just applies because that's just the way that our ears are tuned. And once we understand that, then when you're talking about making kind of low growling sounds or low roaring sounds or whatever, you kind of already have a place to start regardless of what your source is. So for me in particular, we've already kind of started developing the ideas of like what would go into a NeuroBass in the first place. So if I turn this on and we go and do some basic, I guess, processing to this, maybe let's say we want to turn this into a Reese of some sort. Maybe we want to add just a little bit of noise at the end, or maybe even right here. So we can hit Command and go into something like noise, and you only need just a little bit because of how much distortion we have here. But you can already see that we're starting to get there. There isn't really like, you don't have to go much further than this. However, what I would kind of particularly theorize or categorize things of where to go next would obviously to make the sound shine. So that's where we would get into our stereo processing and so forth. But that's for next video. So now that this demonstration is kind of complete and you see how easy it is to kind of develop something that's pretty easy, my advice to you would be to really just spend some time, grab yourself a nice chunky audio form, grab these filter types and see what these basic ones do, because there's only so many different filter types, right? And what happens is, like, whenever you have a complex filter, which we'll make here in a second, it really just becomes a combination of pretty much these to some degree. You've got some slopes, you've got some peaks, you've got some dips. It might be a variation of having a bunch of bell curves. That might be a lot of them to do like a comb filter or something. But at its base, you can use single filters and move them in serial or move them in parallel or whatever to start to create your own filters in that way. It's just understanding how the signal flow goes. So that'll get us into the next thing. I'll talk about probably frequency splitting at the end, but let's take a look at slice EQ. And by the way, I am using kilohertz faceplant, but that's because this is, it just, oh man, it's so good. I talked about this yesterday in the last video. So let's say I wanted to get into complex filtering, right? Well, what are some combinations that we can do? The most common one from like 2012 all the way to 2016 was 2 notches and a boost. So we've got something like this, and then maybe right here we've got something kind of like this. And what these are doing is kind of just sweeping along the frequency range. Now, thanks to Copycat, which is one of the most important things that he taught me, is that whenever you're doing complex filtering on a parametric EQ, it's working in serial. So on one end, the bands are interacting with each other whenever they move. However, it's still on a serial, like, I guess, routing chain. So keep that in mind whenever you do this. Now, within all this stuff, the way that we used to do this was we would use something like ProQ or maybe EQ8 or maybe parametric EQ2 if you're in FL Studio, and you would pretty much automate these over time. Now, I don't do that anymore. And the reason why is because it's too much work. So because of something beautiful like Faceplant, or if you have Bitwig or something that has a modulator on it, you can use either LFOs, multi-stage envelopes, or in this case, I'm going to use randomizers. We can just use these. What I can do is I can grab the cutoff of these here, and now these are interacting with each other. And then what I can do is I can grab the other one and move this to some place. It's where now all of these are interacting in some cool, unpredictable way. I'm not really concerned about what it's doing right now. And even if you are cutting this too much, or let's say like this is cutting out a lot of the low end right here, you can always move this over. You can always move this to some different place as well. Maybe I want this to focus on those low mids like I was talking about. And then maybe for this one here, I want it to do something different. But what we can also do is we can make another randomizer, and we can start to make this be really dramatic by pulling the resonance up and down in this way. So just by stacking these in such a way, we haven't done any frequency splitting or anything to any degree. We're already getting some interesting things by having these filter bands interact with each other. The cool thing about these and doing things in this way is the fact that like whenever we make sounds with our mouth, like it is essentially to some degree projecting a sound from our vocal cord and then using a combination of our lips and our teeth and our tongue to essentially filter things out. That's pretty mind-blowing, right? So for whatever case, like for me, I've been doing this a long time, and obviously like I kind of already am cheating because I know where to go and how to get stuff that works like this. But the key thing that you want to remember is that you can pretty much do any filter shape or multiple or different types of notes that you want to, and I encourage you to experiment. But it doesn't stop there. There's more that we can do. One idea that I want to pitch to you, which is one of the coolest features about Phase Plant, in my opinion, is the fact that with the slice EQ, we have a mix function. So let's pretend that like this is doing too much. Let's pretend like it's cutting too many of the sounds or whatever, and at some points we want it to actually have a little bit of the original character. Well, the reason why this is so cool is because we can use another randomizer or a macro or any other modulator to mess with the mix. So that means that at certain points, it's going to cut a lot of the sound out. And at certain points, it's going to allow the entire chunky waveform, minus this processing, of course, to kind of bleed through or to kind of play through the whole thing. So take a listen to that. Okay, sweet. So let's say that we wanted this to do even more. One quick thing that you can do to try to like just play with some ideas is to take another randomizer like this and add just a little bit of pitch drift to this at a slow rate, because what's going to happen is that that's going to make it sound like it's kind of like, for lack of better description, like in pain or something, right? So if you set this to a really slow rate and you turn up the jitter, take a listen to that. Sweet. So as you can tell, like we've already gotten a really interesting sound just by stacking distortion and filters on top of each other. And that's one thing that I think is really important to remember whenever you're doing this kinds of stuff, is that there's always a relationship between the effects that you stack on. And while it's important to explore and like you gotta obviously have to figure out this stuff for yourself and like do your own work of being like, okay, well, how does this work with this? When you keep that in mind, then essentially like you can start to build any kind of sound out of any sound. Right? Any characteristic of like electronic digital processing, I would say, because you can't necessarily just make something sound, you know, like somebody is singing or something. Like with enough processing, you can get close, but I guess I wanted to just make sure that the right mindset is out for that. But if you're trying to turn something into a bass or you're trying to turn something into a pad, that's more so what I mean, as opposed to, you know, you can make something that sounds like a taxi completely sound like something different. There's a lot more legwork that goes into that. Okay, sorry, just wanted to be clear on that. Within all this stuff, if I were to turn everything off, whenever you guys are doing these kinds of processes, again, it's really important to be mindful about what frequencies you're boosting and what frequencies you are, how do you say, either cutting or whatever. We talked about the vocal cord thing or whatever, but one other thing that you can do to kind of practice and understand these things is also do frequency stacks, because resonance also plays a key part in this stuff. I'm actually going to use the nonlinear filter for this because I think this is going to be a better example. So if we have a sine wave here and we've got a band pass, this is what it sounds like on its own. I'm going to turn the saturation off. Cool. Now let's go ahead and turn the saturation up. This is a distortion unit or a drive type, or drive mode rather, that is pushing this through. So I'm just going to leave it on saturated for now, just for the sake of time, but take a listen to this. And if you've watched my last video that I recently put up, you can kind of see that whenever these are stacked on top of each other via resonance like this, let's go ahead and duplicate that and maybe one more time, then you can start to get some interesting tonalities from the way that these resonances stack on top of themselves. See, and that's kind of getting into that really cool sound that I did a speedrun on earlier in the year. So what we can also do is maybe mix and match these different distortion types on top of themselves. And what I'm also going to do is just push the cutoff of maybe one a little bit more, kind of like this. And let's listen to how that sounds. Let's push some distortion through it. And then we can maybe try different modes on here. Okay, so like you kind of have to be careful with this, and it's always good to put a limiter at the end, but you can start to see that by stacking these in a particular way that you can actually end up getting some really interesting results sometimes. And it's not just that you push distortion into a filter, you can also do the opposite where you have some kind of distortion after the filter in order to bring back some of the frequencies that you're obviously cutting, right? Which is usually a more common practice anyways. But if we use something like a saturator, noise. Then what we can do is maybe come back here, add our slice EQ, and then we can start to turn this other stuff on and just kind of see how it sounds. It might be cool, it might not be cool, I don't really know, but let's go ahead and find out. Cool. But you can kind of tell by mixing and matching some of these things that like there's a bunch of different combinations that you can do, and like each one has a signature sound. So I would encourage you to not only mess with the bandpass, but see what happens when you stack a notch on top of this with the bandpass with something else of the sort. And that's going to ultimately lead you towards having a better understanding of filtering as a whole. So now let's go ahead and talk about something that is probably the most like, I guess like you can't really like talk about NEUROBASS without frequency splitting, right? And lucky for us, we have Multipass here, which pretty much does all the work for us. So in regards to filtering here, it's important to kind of like think or to rationalize what we're going to do or what kind of filtering we're going to do on these bands. And this is going to sound stupidly obvious, but sometimes like I didn't until I had Multipass, it didn't really make as much sense to me. I would just do like different band splitting or frequency dependent splitting and just do whatever. But just bear with me for a second. Okay, so the low band is going from 0 to 245. Then we've got the mid band from 245 to 3K, and then we have this at above 3K. So obviously it wouldn't make sense to have a low pass filter on here because it's not going to cut any frequencies. There's not anything that this is going to have to work with. It wouldn't start to do anything even if we have a chunky waveform. Like I know that there's some crossover or whatever, but that's a different story for a different day. But until we get to anything that's 245 and below, the filter isn't going to react in any way. So what we would do is instead is focus on what this can cut through or what would make sense for this. So if we're focusing on this, then what we can do is boost this up. And suddenly we have something that the filter can work with now. So whenever you guys are doing these kinds of things, then you might want to think about like how your, I guess, filters are going to cut through the specific frequencies if you're doing band splitting in this way. So for the mid band, you kind of have a lot to play with. There's a lot that you can do. And the other cool thing to think about too is kind of like what I talked about from before is that all of these have a mix. And so you can kind of interpolate between having something like do a super filter and then messing with the mix or whatever, but possibilities are limitless. So it's really common for us to have something either like a notch or have something like a band pass and focus on these low, mid to mid frequencies. For now, I'm going to focus on a notch because I don't want to cut out too much of the sound. If you were going to use a band pass, then like the band pass is like pretty much the most extreme filter that we have. And for some reason, it really cuts out a whole lot of the sound. So you'll have to do a lot of work to bring it back. Whereas a notch, in some case or another, has a lot more flexibility in how wide it can go and how much it can cut, if that makes sense. Because instead of it just focusing on what's in the middle, it focuses on what's on the sides. And another point that we can talk about too is that let's say you've only got 2 bands to work with, right? Well, what you can essentially do is actually create a custom notch filter here, which is very commonly done, kind of like this, where you are notching out the low end of some degree, and then you are cutting and doing a different style of thing over here, and messing with the high band. So what we're actually doing is actually we're messing with, this would actually be categorized as a band pass, but you can flip-flop it and you can have them interact with each other in such a way that can sometimes lead to some really cool, interesting results. So like by understanding like what you're cutting across, if you're thinking from low to high, the frequencies that you're doing really just depend on that. And the only difference between what we're doing here and the slice EQ is that these have independent signal chains that you can do on your own as opposed to putting everything on serial and having it go all together, if that makes sense. So with that in mind, we can kind of continue in that way. where we would do something like a notch or a band pass, and then on the high end we would have some kind of low pass filter, right? So in conjunction, all of these are interacting with the optimal frequency range in order to create that variation that we're talking about, in order to create that interest or to get the most dramatic impact that we would be looking for. So this one is cutting that one's doing its own thing. Unfortunately, with Multipass, we only have 2 modulators. We can do more by setting the cutoff to a macro, and we can set a macro to the cutoff here and then use a modulator to mess with the macro. But for now, I'm going to kind of make that, just keep it a little bit more simple and just maybe do the opposite of what this one is doing. So that way they're just kind of all moving together. But this is what this would sound like. So with all these things in mind, like if you essentially treat these frequencies as a frequency spectrum from low to high, and then like because these are in parallel, you can do your individual processing. This would be the most important one, but you can kind of pretty much do whatever you want in order to kind of like quote unquote like shape and characterize your sound. And you can even have like a master filter over on the end if you want to dictate everything, right? So maybe this movement is really cool, but you want it to kind of open and close more. And filtering like can also be used as an additive means as well. And kind of like what we talked about before, like with the band pass being focused on like the low mid frequencies or whatever, you can take this and use a bell curve. And let's say you're cutting something on those low mids, and you can do this on any part of the chain. It doesn't really matter. But what we can do is take that same one, which is right here, and focus on trying to boost that up. That's moving downwards. So now these two are moving together in sync, right? That sounds really fat, but that's intended. So you can even do a boosting means. And the cool thing about this is like if you were to do something kind of like a nonlinear filter as well, then we can go back into the same ideas that we were talking about from before. Although it's kind of important to note that this actually doesn't have a bell curve, so like you would be cutting something and there's a trade-off in that sense. In between that, if you focus on, you know, maybe setting something here to a modulator or whatever, like let's say again, like I did want to do this where I have the cutoff set to a macro here. So we'll just place this at a specific degree so that way it doesn't go all the way up or down. We can come out here and now we can use this as a modulator. And now this is going to move from the outside in between something right here. And you can see that like the routing options and the possibilities with this have so much potential in order for us to get some kind of interesting sounds out of this. But wait, what happens if you want to do this on a micro level? The cool thing, or the crazy thing rather, is that as opposed to having a single filter on here, for one, we can stack filters downward or vertically this way, but we can also use a slice EQ to create more complex filters in its own right. We can do something kind of like this and create, you know, some kind of vowel of some sort, and instead of maybe going and doing all of the individual things, we can kind of cheat and just use the offset here to manipulate that in a different way. So I'll take LFO2 because it's only got one, and then we can kind of shape this towards the low mid region here or try to find a nice little middle ground. But like I said before, you really want to be careful with this kind of stuff because you don't usually want this to go up and down the frequency range completely. You kind of just want to focus on like a key range of this in order to get something interesting, or to get something that's like, how do I say, something that's more usable or something that's more enjoyable for that sense. But you know, play Goldilocks. This is too far. This isn't enough. You got to find just right. Does that all make sense? I hope so. I'm talking to myself. So there's that. Now, the other things that I want to talk about, because we've covered complex filtering, we've covered basic filtering, is the fact that a flanger and a phaser in some way or another are actually also filters as well as a comb filter, which I gave it away. Comb filter, phaser, flanger are super similar in the sense that they are amalgamations of a comb filter in one way or another. So whenever we're talking about filtering and stuff, right, we're just talking about boosting / cutting frequencies, mostly cutting frequencies, right? You're filtering something through. It's like when you've got dirty water and then you're like, I want a clean glass of water, and you filter it through, and then you've got the pure, right? That's what we're doing, is we're making pureness. We're taking something that's super dirty and then making the sound pure. Okay, that's a bad analogy, but it works. Unfortunately, the comb filter in its own right doesn't really show what it's doing, but just think of it actually looking like a comb to where it has a bunch of peaks and a bunch of dips. So I guess I'll just make one super quickly. This filtering would get into something that's more considered, can also be considered getting into physical modeling if you have the correct frequency range here. But essentially a comb filter looks something like this. And a phaser flanger comb is just some variation of this in particular. So if I were to place this on the master, let me turn these other things off. It's kind of hard to detect, I know, so I'm going to push these up a little bit more, but I think it's important to kind of be able to distinguish what kind of sounds this stuff makes. And you can always create more bands too if you need to, but having these super crazy peaks like this and then kind of messing with it. Okay, hopefully that was a little bit more obvious, but those are the kinds of things that you want to be considerate of. Now that we understand that, if we kind of listen to what some of these other things can do, which is the phaser, flanger, and comb filter, then you can start to see how these can give you some specific characteristics as well. So if I just focus on this band and we play a sound, that kind of sounds like something that we've already maybe heard before, right? Which could be a flanger. So let's take a listen to trying to get a similar sound out of that. See the similarities? So of course it's not quite the same, and I would say that like these are again just specific presets of this, but these in essence are still kind of like would be considered in the same category. Just for the sake of understanding, we've also got our phaser. Unfortunately, this again doesn't have a visual, but that's okay. Take a listen. Hopefully you can hear kind of like the wobbling sound that's kind of within this. But I kind of did something subconsciously where I added these effects toward the middle. And I don't remember who said it. I think it was Frequent, but he or somebody anyways said that the magic is in the middle. So whenever you're applying these, I think that the best place to put them usually is in the middle. Now, on the low end, we usually want a clean low end, right? So it makes sense not to do a whole lot of stereo crazy processing to this, although if you just want to go for something interesting, then by all means do it. If you want something that has a lot of phasiness and stuff, that has a lot of noticeable movement, then you would put that on the middle band. And then if you want to really spread everything out, or you really just want to go crazy and all that stuff, then you can also do that to the high end as well. This would be, you know, cool to maybe play something like an ensemble on here, which I'll talk more about when we get into part 3. But just know that these can all still be used as filtering and still would be categorized as filtering to some degree. So now that we have everything, this is pretty much like all there is to it. This is pretty much all you have to do to get into making the most complex filters or whatever as you can, because it's really just a bunch of simple things that you continue to stack together in such a way. If you don't have phase plan and you have something like Ableton, you can still do this by working horizontally, right? You can still do frequency splitting. You can still kind of like make different chain stacks and all that stuff. However, it's really just a matter of how you approach it, which would kind of lead us into the final thing that I'll talk about, which is just the idea of regular signal splitting. So if I use snap heap, I don't even have to do that. I can kind of send this to parallel lanes as well. But if I focus on snap heap and I turn all of these into parallel, then we have the entire frequency signal being split between these. And so what you can do with that instead is, let's say you've got these crazy filters, right, that are cutting a bunch, and they're all kind of like really dramatic in this way of like, you know, you still have, you still have something that is along these means. Well, one approach that you can take in order to kind of play along between these is, instead of thinking about stacking the sounds in this way, because eventually like some frequencies are going to stack in amplitude, you can play with the mix in between these along with the movement in order to get something more complex. And so this would take a long time to set up, so I kind of just want to introduce this to you in that way. But you don't have to frequency split. You don't have to make things more complicated than they need to be. It's just a matter of getting into the idea of exploring in order to find new sounds, in order to find those things. Add that on top of the other processing that we do with effects, and suddenly you have a whole brand new world of neuro-based sound design that you can get into. Then you start thinking about changing the source sound. Then you start thinking about of applying FM. You start thinking about of granular synthesis or changing the pitch or whatever, and suddenly you may or may not be a master of sound design. So with all that, I think that that's pretty much the gist and one of the like overarching ways that you can do filtering in creative ways. Yeah, so we talked about how to make custom filters. We talked about how to do basic filtering to get a lot out of it. We talked about the relationship between boosting frequencies and where to focus your filters on, whatever you put that. We talked about how to frequency split. We talked about band splitting. And then we talked about kind of just the overarching idea about mixing and matching and how to make that work in between. So if I missed anything, then let me know in the comments. But I think that this is probably the most that I can, or the furthest that I can take you for the idea of filtering in its own right as of now. So thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to stick around for part 3. And do me a favor, if you guys got to this point of the video, please do me a favor, like my video, subscribe to the channel, leave me a comment, and help me get back in the algorithm. That's pretty much all I got for you guys. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one.